These reflections that I have gathered from Don Quixote come mostly and almost exclusively from my own reading of Don Quixote, of course. So that is the main source. That is the main resource that I recommend you. Okay, but if you are interested, of course you can go to the Biblioteca Virtual Cervantes and look for articles like El Quijote, Crítica Social y Moral de su Época by María Lourdes Rollano, 2017. Cervantes y la Libertad by Luis Rosales. Arias y de la Canal El Quijote Liberal, 2005. Lourdes Rollano Gutiérrez. Pierre Menard, autor del Quijote, 1993. Fernando Lázaro Carreter. That's a very good study about some concepts in Don Quixote. If you want something in English, you have this. You have this. Anyway, you have other resources that have also been written in English about Don Quixote. Let me think if there's anything else. Well, there are a few other studies. Oh, sure, yes. I almost forgot. And this is probably the most authorized biography and the most complete biography of Cervantes that brings together his work and his life, and how there are many autobiographical references in his work that refer to what he himself did. Right, and I'm going to speak a little about his life, and don't be intimidated. It looks like a very bulky, thick book, but really, it's only this, because all this other part, so almost half of it, is footnotes. Footnotes and bibliography, which speaks very eloquently about how well-grounded this is. Right, so I am very thankful that Father Miguel got us this volume for the library. Last session we spoke about Cervantes and how he was his character was stolen, and he wanted to prevent anyone else from stealing his character, so that is why he ends up killing him. And by the way, he kills him all of a sudden because he's he's going through adventures, one adventure after the other, and all of a sudden he falls ill and he dies. So that's the final chapter. So it's not something that you can see coming. It's chapter 74 of Don Quixote. So chapter 73, he's in perfect health and he's looking for adventures, and in chapter 74 he dies to prevent anyone from writing any sequels to Don Quixote. However, that character he was so jealous of is not his. Yes. There's an anonymous poem in which a farmer named Bartolo starts reading poetry, and in those times poetry and chivalry were pretty much the same. So that distinction that we can make now, that we can make in our days, was not known in the times of Cervantes. So he, by reading poetry, he goes mad and he starts imagining that there are Moors, and he fights against them, or he imagines that a couple is the king and the queen. So he goes looking for he goes and he wanders around looking for adventures, and it resembles, especially the first part of Don Quixote, resembles very much this other anonymous writing. But of course, Cervantes expands a lot more, and some say that in literature, robbery is only justified when it's followed by murder. So if you take something from another author, you have to surpass that author. And without a doubt, without any question, Cervantes did surpass that anonymous author, whoever that author was, whose name is unknown to us, but the farmer's name is Bartolo. So it's el romance del labrador Bartolo. Okay. That's a first remark. Second, in the anthology, I included chapters 12 through 14 that speak about the lady shepherd Marcella, right? Some have seen in it an expansion of St. John of the Cross poem on the shepherd that is mourning for his irrequited love for a lady shepherd. So this expansion of Marcella, who rejects the love of Chrysostomus, is a very reflective part of Don Quixote that has very little to do with the plot, but has a lot to do with Cervantes' thought and his time. And some have argued that freedom is the hinge of the entire work. And we shouldn't take this for granted. Maybe in our times and in our days, freedom is an almost sacred value, right? And we all cling to freedom, and maybe there's even an excess of it, right? But in times of Cervantes, that was not the way things worked. It was not envisioned. It was not necessarily envisioned by that. It was not necessarily envisioned in this way, and we have to recognize how Cervantes goes way beyond his time in advocating for this freedom. You can see how he advocates for freedom when he frees those who were condemned to row in the gallows, and also when it comes to this lady shepherd Marcella. Why did I select this part? First, because it's a complete part, it's a complete section, and because it not only speaks about freedom, but it also speaks about the role of women in society. This is in Spanish, but I'm gonna make a few comments in English, okay? So, here the author brings in Juan Luis Vives, a thinker of the 1500s who wrote De Institutione Feminae Christianae, and he regards women like, of course, a second class in society that was always subordinated to the masculine figure, and they could not even they didn't even have a saying in whom they wanted to marry to begin with. Married women should be submitted to their husbands, and that goes completely in line with what a few years before that St. Thomas More had written in Utopia. So that was the common trend in that time. So to present us the shepherd Marcella, that is, let's say individualistic, that has a saying in whom she wants to marry, or if she wants to marry, that is way advanced for his own time. And he reflects also about the social position of women and how there's, of course, inequality. Notwithstanding that inequality, Cervantes presents women who fight for their right to decide about their own marriage and about their own relationships. So many scholars have argued that Cervantes is a proponent and an advocate of feminine equality and of feminine right to decide to begin with. Now, of course, this is something that triggers a profound reflection, but it's not as simple as it might seem, because you might say, well, now we have the thought of Cervantes himself, right? End of story. Now we know what Cervantes said. And I found, of course, this whole volume is very interesting, but now the author quotes another scholar whose name is Valera, and he says that in 1862, Valera published a study in which he asks himself, what is the philosophy of Cervantes? Is there a philosophy of Cervantes? Is there a thought of Cervantes? And anyone can access Don Quixote. And in the second part, Cervantes makes a reflection about his own work, referring to the first part. And he says, I translate, children can handle Don Quixote, young men can read it, mature men can understand it, old men celebrate Don Quixote. So anyone can access Don Quixote, although we all access Don Quixote in different ways. So, is Cervantes teaching something with Don Quixote, or is he mocking something? And that is something that it's almost impossible to know. It's almost impossible to know that. So some say that, I'm gonna make a paraphrasis of what is written here, because I don't want to translate word by word. He says, is there a philosophy of Don Quixote? Is there a thought of Cervantes? And he says, I am like doubting Thomas. So until you show it to me, I will not believe that there's a thought. I will not believe that there's a philosophy of Saint Thomas, of Don Quixote, because you might very well say that he was just trying to avoid censure. So he had his own thoughts, but he presents these thoughts in the mouth of a madman, and in that way, even if he mocks royal institutions, right? It's a madman who's speaking. So I, the author, I'm not endorsing, yes, these tenets. So was Cervantes really pointing that out? I find also in Don Quixote a profoundly Catholic book. He even takes pride in the second part, stating that he didn't write anything contrary to the teachings of the church, referring to the first part. And of course, he continues with that common trend. And one of them, there are many sayings in Don Quixote, but when they come looking for Dulcinea, and they are wandering and they come to El Toboso, where Dulcinea was from, it's night. The dogs were barking and they were looking, and they bump on the church. Con la iglesia hemos dado. We have stumbled upon the church. So, of course, that's you can understand it in the most physical way, like they were riding and then they couldn't continue because they stumbled upon the church. But I think that there's a spiritual reflection upon that. There's a point where the church remains. It's a block that cannot be moved. And we have our own journey, but that block cannot be moved, cannot be shaken from where it is. And some have seen in Don Quixote an anti-Catholic book claiming that he was mocking the teachings of the church because he presents those teachings in the mouth of a madman. But some others have argued exactly the opposite. And personally, I have found profound spiritual reflections and profound spirituality and profound spiritual knowledge in Don Quixote. Actually, I didn't have this as part of my outline today, but I just read you my reflections about the worldview in Don Quixote, and that's a very interesting theme that can be delved into even more than what I have written in these 3 or 4 pages, right? There's also a reflection about the understanding that we have about ourselves. So in Don Quixote, if you read Don Quixote as a reflection about how we envision ourselves, you will find also lots and lots of material. And he will touch that kernel of human nature that makes us who we are. But I have also gathered, I think, enough material. I haven't digested everything, so I still have to write it, but I have gathered enough material to write a reflection of Don Quixote, like a work in which the tension and the polarity of values is illustrated. Which values am I referring to? The values of family life and of consecrated life. Don Quixote is someone who has no family because he has devoted himself completely to the ideal that he pursues. And of course, this is not a novel about consecrated chastity. No, it's not. But it can be read from that perspective. How that consecration demands our complete self-giving, our complete devotion. On the other hand, we also have the values of family that are mostly represented with Sancho Panza, who nonetheless has to come back to his family and has to argue with his wife and has to convince her that he has to go, right? And the convincing her is not easy. And although Sancho Panza is usually the picturesque character that uses a low-level language, when he speaks with his wife, he becomes so grandiloquent that his wife's speech seems plain, right? And of course here, Cervantes has to alternate the two tones, and he comes up with a very crafty device. How can he make Sancho Panza speak in a grandiloquent way when he speaks with his wife, Teresa Panza, and speak in a low level when he speaks with Don Quixote? How can that be? And he says, well, it's an apocryphal, but nonetheless it's written there. So he says that this is not actually written in the records, that somebody inserted this as an apocryphal story, and he himself states that the speech of Sancho Panza is too elevated for being the speech of Sancho Panza. But nonetheless, he can insert this as part of the story. Remember, I also mentioned how a great classical work is a work that you can read once, twice, and several times, and every time you find something new. When Don Quixote charges against, I think there was a group of shepherds, and he charges against them because he felt that his honor had been lessened, that his honor had been harmed, and he had to vindicate his own honor. Right. Sancho Panza tries to deter him from doing so, and he says, what do you care about your honor? What do you care about vindicating that right? And but Don Quixote is passionate and is adamant, and he wants to charge and he wants to attack those shepherds. When Don Quixote is rushing against those shepherds, Sancho Panza says, I'm a married man, I've got children, and I know how to yield. The first time I read it, I said, okay, so that is what Sancho Panza says. Okay, being married and having a child, yes, you learn how to yield. So you can also see that polarity of values between family life and consecrated life in a very profound way. Or the reflections that Cervantes makes about marriage in some of the stories that he inserts in Don Quixote are also very profound, and I find them very, very enriching for spiritual life. So it's a profoundly humanistic, it's a very humanistic work, it's a very spiritual work, and unfortunately we cannot completely state that this was Cervantes' mind. Was he mocking what he was saying because it's presented in the speech and in the thoughts of a madman, or was Cervantes actually endorsing that position? Right. So that's a question that remains open, and I think it will remain open. But nonetheless, I think it's important for us to consider what comes there. Okay, yes. So I've spoken about his philosophy, I've spoken about his politics, I've spoken about his religion, and what he states is very profound, it's very much in line. And now we can ask ourselves, who was he? Who was Cervantes? Because a lot of his life remains obscure. A lot of, and many things around his life remain obscure. Beginning with his name. Miguel de Cervantes was written with a B, not with a V, but the printers wrote it with a V, and his actual name was Miguel de Cervantes y Cortinas. And it's unclear why he ended up using the last name Saavedra. Saavedra. Some say that he had a very long distant relative whose last name was Saavedra. Others say that that's how he was called during his captivity in Argel, because there's an Arabic word that is like Shabidra, that means one-handed. And you know that Cervantes has been commonly known as the one-handed man of Lepanto. He did have a hand, but his hand was paralyzed, and he couldn't even hold a book with his left hand. Why? Well, you know why, right? Because during the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, he was wounded. He received a gunshot. It was a distant relative of guns. It was an arquebus. I don't know the name of that particular weapon, but it was something like a primitive or rudimentary type of gun, and he received 3 or 4 gunshots, some of them on the chest, and another gunshot on the hand, and it took him a while to heal, and his hand never recovered, so his hand was practically always paralyzed, but that didn't prevent him from continuing his work as a soldier. But let me just go back to the beginning of his life, and it's commonly stated, and most sources agree, that Cervantes was born on the 29th of September of 1547. 29th of September, which is the feast of St. Michael the Archangel, that of course gave him his name, Miguel. By the way, a few decades or a few centuries, some years after that, another great writer would also be born on the 29th of September, Miguel de Unamuno. Both of them were born on the 29th of September. He was born on the 29th of September 1547 in Alcalá de Henares. Alcalá de Henares. That is why he's also known as the Alcalaino. Since his childhood, we find him suffering from poverty and obscurity. His father was a surgeon, which doesn't mean a surgeon in the medical term, in the medical way we understand it in our days. That means that his father would bleed people and help with very rudimentary medical procedures. So that was his father's craft. His grandfather had been a quite successful lawyer, so they had some resources, but at the same time it was not something stable, and they did have to struggle with poverty, especially after his father contracted some debts and had to be was sent to prison. That plunged the family. He had, I don't know, something like 5 or 6 siblings, so they were plunged into poverty. In addition, they had an unstable financial situation, and it's almost stated as a fact. Of course, many things remain obscure, but most scholars also agree that he came from a family of converted Jews. You know that in the late 1400s, many Jews and Muslims were forced to convert to Catholicism if they wanted to remain in the Spanish Peninsula. And it's likely that he came from a family of converted Jews. And in spite of their conversion, they were not always welcomed, and they were not accepted, and they were not well received in society. So there were many hardships that they have to deal with. Some have claimed that he studied 2 years of philosophy in the University of Salamanca, but those are mere conjectures, and nothing is known for sure about his education. You read Don Quixote and you see that whoever wrote this must have had a very solid formation. Right. Both literary, philosophical, a very profound literary formation, a very profound philosophical formation, a very profound, even maybe theological or at least spiritual formation. Whoever wrote it, meaning Cervantes, had that experience, but was that something that he had gathered just loosely and freely from his readings scattered here and there, or did he receive some formal education? That's something that we cannot know for sure, but nobody takes it farther than that. At the most, he studied 2 years of philosophy in the University of Salamanca. In 1569, we find him in Rome. Some research has shown that in that same year, 1569, there was an arrest warrant against Miguel de Cervantes. It could be someone who had exactly the same name, so it's not something for sure. But whoever that Miguel de Cervantes was, maybe it was the great writer, maybe it was somebody with the same name. But regardless of who that was, this arrest warrant came because he had wounded someone in a duel. And as a penalty for that, he had to be arrested and his right hand had to be chopped off. So it's likely he very conveniently escaped to Rome to avoid remaining in Madrid. It might be a mere coincidence that in 1569 we find him in Rome, but the dates coincide. Right. Well, and actually the document states that Miguel de Cervantes, there was the warrant for his arrest, and he escaped. That's what we know. And conveniently we find Miguel de Cervantes in 1569 in Rome, serving a cardinal who was also very young. Cervantes must have been just a little more than a little over 20 years. I don't think he was 30 at the time, and he was serving a cardinal who was practically his same age. The name of the cardinal was Julio de Aquaviva, who had spent like 4 or 5 years in Spain and then moved back to Italy, where Cervantes served him. And of course that also gives us a hint into his education, his background, if he could work as the secretary of a cardinal, and at the same time how he continued furthering his formation and his education. And in the year after that, 1570, he joined the Spanish Navy that was stationed in Naples. As you know, in those times, Naples was also part of the empire of Philip II. So he joined the Spanish army, and in 1571 he joined the Holy League, and he took part in that famous battle of Lepanto. At the time he was affected with malaria, so his captain asked him to stay behind and to recover before he could continue with the battle, but he was determined, so he was entrusted with a small boat with 12 men, as the commander of 12 men, to attack the enemy gallows. And it was in this battle where he received the gunshot that would paralyze his left hand. But regardless, he continued serving as a soldier for the Spanish army, even if it took him a while to recover from the wounds he had received on the chest, and he never recovered from the injury he received on his left hand. I'm not sure how long he served as a soldier, maybe something like 4 or 5 years after that, and then on his way back to Spain, when he was in Barcelona, he was taken captive by the Ottoman corsairs, and that captivity lasted for 5 years. He was ransomed by the Trinitarians, and eventually, after his ransom was paid, he moved back to Spain, where he never succeeded as a novelist, although he started writing some great novels like La Galatea, which he regarded as his greatest novel. Of course, history has regarded Don Quixote as the greatest novel by Cervantes, but Don Quixote, but Cervantes was not so proud of Don Quixote. He was very proud of La Galatea. He thought that was his greatest novel, and he didn't make a living as a writer, so he had to hire himself as a spy for Philip II. So it's yes, of course the title was not spy; it was an informant, because he already knew the north of Africa quite well. So it's likely he returned to the north of Africa, and as a tax collector, sometimes his finances didn't match, so he was imprisoned a couple of times because the collection didn't add. And I think I've spoken about the end of his life and the publishing of Don Quixote in the previous session. So in 1606 he moved to Madrid, the year he published Don Quixote, and he never left Madrid after that. And he joined the Franciscan Third Order in 1608. And he asked to be buried in the convent of the Barefoot Trinitarians. And he died in 1616. Okay. I hope this was instructive, and I hope you enjoyed it, brothers. Thank you very much.